We do it in Ames, the city of Ames. Should we build a new high school? Yes or no? That's a referendum. California does it for the whole state. So you can change the law in California in one election. I'm pretty sure that's how they got weed legalized just recently in California, is through this proposition. And they just number them. And so Proposition 13 in 1978 slashed property taxes and forced painful cuts in California's government spending. So Ronald Reagan uses that and brings it to the national government as kind of a campaign promise that our government is big, fat, sloppy, overburdened with bureaucracy, and we need to cut. And the way to cut government is to cut taxes. And you know, you can see it there, smaller government. Big government is the villain. You might recognize that the modern Republican Party, that's prior to Trump, are still championing many of these ideas. They might have had difficulty with the follow-through of actually cutting, because much of what's in the government the United States federal government's budget is mostly entitlements and military spending. So this is where Reagan pulled a fast one. He wanted to cut taxes, so he did, but he massively increased military spending. And at that time, the U.S. didn't have huge deficits. I don't even think the U.S. deficit was not even $1 trillion. It was probably $500 billion. And so the Reagan administration just said, deficits don't matter. We can overspend for a while. Don't worry about it. They didn't want to spend on entitlements. They wanted to spend on the military. And that's also been a modern Republican position, is to increase military spending. For some reason, at the time, that yet you could make the argument that we have to have a bigger military. Reagan's goals. Reaganomics. Supply side economics. So those are two things I need to explain in order for you to understand his domestic policies. Reagan's domestic goals: reduce the power of labor unions, reduce government involvement in business. Reagan domestic objectives. So there's going to be a tax cut, and then reduce the power of labor unions. Reduce government regulation of business. Well, I mean, to be fair, that's parallel to what he's saying about smaller government, right? So the tax cut that they got passed, it lowered the individual rate. So the top rate went from 70% to 50%. And then the bottom rate, of course there's more than the top and the bottom, there's like 5 rates, but the bottom rate went from 14% to 11%. But this high rate, I think under Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was 90%. If you earned over a certain amount of money, you paid 90% of it to the U.S. government in taxes. And so Reagan got a huge drop. Just by comparison, when Obama and George W. Bush were talking about tax cuts. The Bush tax cut went from like 39 to 37. That's a lot different than 70 to 50. So this idea that a tax cut is good for business and it's good for the economy is from Ronald Reagan. In many ways, Ronald Reagan has the architect of the Republican Party platform ever since. They've been following his model in campaigns, and not always so much in practice, because you can see they are unable to cut the entitlements. Do you guys know that word, entitlement? It's a government program that mandates the government must pay. Once you turn 65, you get Medicare. Doesn't matter if you never worked in your life. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. If you're a US citizen and you're 65 years old, you are entitled to Medicare, free health care paid for by the government. And Social Security, anybody who worked and paid the Social Security tax for X number of quarters is entitled to a check every month for the rest of their life once they turn a certain age. Well, those are laws. Government can't just say we're not going to pay those. They must pay them, so that's what's driving U.S. deficits and the U.S. debt. Is 1/2 of the government budget is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and they have no wiggle room. They must pay those. And then about the other half is military spending. Okay, it also made a big reduction in the estate tax. Do you know what the estate tax is? If you're Bill Gates and you're worth $80 billion, when you die, the government gets a certain percentage of your wealth. Upon your death, your estate is taxed. Now that's only true if you make it's only true if you have over $5 million. The estate tax doesn't affect anybody who has less than $5 million. It's kind of a problem for farmers because in Iowa their farmland is really expensive. What is supply side economics? It says if you cut taxes for the wealthy, they will create jobs that will stimulate economic activity. So it could be called trickle down. That term kind of came from the 20s and Andrew Mellon and Harding and Coolidge. But when you get to Reagan, he's calling it supply side economics. Because he's saying if the businesses are created, if they create the supply, the economic activity will happen. So they call it supply side economics. And then people who were his critics began to call it Reaganomics. And then when it didn't really pan out, they called it voodoo economics. So there was quite a bit of criticism from the other side of Reagan's economic policy. Here's what happened. 80, 81, 82, the economy continued to go down, carrying over from Carter. But in 83, the US economy and US GDP started to pick up again. But it's probably from, well, your textbook says, massive military spending that the Reagan budgets brought. They brought huge new amounts of money into the military. And that's probably what turned the economy around. That's a little bit complicated. It says to explain the increase in GDP in 1983, some analysts point out not the tax cut, but the huge increases in defense spending. The US spent $2 trillion on defense in the 1980s. Now, what neoconservatives will say is, well, yeah, but we won the Cold War. We outspent the Soviets. Reagan went to Berlin in his presidency. I think it probably was in his second term. And John F. Kennedy had gone to Berlin when the Berlin Wall was constructed, and John F. Kennedy went there and said, "I am a jelly donut." You've heard that, right? A Berliner. He said, "Ich ein Berliner," right? You guys know the phrase? But it turns out a Berliner is a nickname in Berlin for a certain jelly donut. The Germans understood what he meant. He said, "I am a Berliner." And so the United States kind of championed West Berlin as a symbol in the Cold War that we're holding up the free part of East Germany. Well, Reagan went there and said, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. Tear down this wall." Well, it's interesting, in 1989, when communism collapsed, the people of Berlin, that's the first thing they took sledgehammers to is the Berlin Wall, right? It had become a symbol of the Cold War, a symbol of Soviet communism and the Soviet sphere of influence. And so when it came down, it's like a tangible evidence that the Cold War was over and communism was imploding. Well, that's a whole nother world studies topic. Why did the Soviet communist economies collapse, and why did Soviet communism itself collapse? But I think it's primarily because Russians got jealous that Americans had freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and Americans had a much more prosperous economy than the Soviets had. I think that's what caused Soviet communism to implode. Essentially, of these policies, the result is U.S. GDP growth, but the gap between rich and poor accelerates. So they deployed supply-side economics or trickle-down economics, and they were able to get the U.S. GDP going again, but the gap between the rich and poor widened. But a caveat here is, did the U.S. GDP start growing again because they cut taxes for the rich, or did it get going again because they poured a huge amount of money into military spending to stimulate the economy? Those are all pretty specific domestic policies. What questions do you have? Any? Questions are worth $1 million. Anybody got one? What about this? Those of you who actually follow politics in the modern era, even just a little, does this sound like the way Republican talking points are today? You guys don't follow politics, do you? Well, I guess that's my little mini thesis here, is the reason Ronald Reagan is so important is he was basically the architect of the Republican Party's platform and policies for the next 30 years. Maybe 40 years. The problem with that for modern Republicans is it's not 1980, right? The world has changed in some very dramatic ways. And of course, Donald J. Trump is a problem for the Republican Party as well, right? What I mean by that is the potential to split the party in two and concede power in the House, the Senate, and the White House is pretty big threat, right? Okay, next up, Reagan foreign policy.